There is a book entitled simply Night. It was written a number of years ago by Elie Wiesel. And maybe his name sounds familiar. Elie Wiesel was a man who devoted his entire adult life to writing and speaking about the Holocaust. Elie Wiesel himself, as a boy, was a prisoner at Auschwitz and observed the terrible events that took place in that setting. But he not only wanted to write about the Holocaust to keep the memory of 6 million victims alive, but he also wanted to prevent future Holocausts. And he tried to speak out anywhere he saw injustice take place. But in his book that was entitled Night, Elie Wiesel described something that happened when he was there at Auschwitz. A day came when there was a very little boy who was caught stealing food. And in order to make an example of him, the guards called all of the other inmates together, assembled them there, and in front of them erected a gallows. And then they proceeded to bring this little boy up front and to put him to death by hanging. It was a terrible, gruesome sight. And Elie Wiesel, in writing about this, said all of the crew was totally silent and felt as though the very life had been taken out of them. And somewhere behind him, he heard somebody whisper, "Where is God?" Now, to those of us who are Christians, anytime we see senseless death, we have a response that says, that's where God is. And we make that claim because that's what God himself, in the form of Jesus Christ, endured. A senseless, painful death on a cross. And ever since, we can say, God has been in those places where people suffer and hurt. But we also say something more than just that God knows our pain. We say that the pain that God endured in the form of Jesus Christ was somehow an unfolding of God's plan. That God might put right this world. God might release all of us from the power of sin and death. God might give to us the gift of new life. That's the claim we make. And yet at the same time we claim that, we also probably should say, we know that raises many questions. And when I say that, it's because we, throughout these weeks, are raising hard questions that very often faithful Christians carry and ask about the number of things that our faith says. And this whole matter of Jesus' death surely is one of those things that people have questions about, because they wonder, well, how does that work? How does Jesus dying somehow change us? Now, let me just give you a quick theology class lesson, which is to say, what we're talking about here, there's a shorthand version of speaking about it, and that's to use the word atonement. We sometimes talk about the atonement. What we're trying to talk about is Jesus dying on a cross, but what that accomplished. What did that do for all of us? The word atone, we don't use it much anymore, but to atone something outside of church means you make amends for, you cover up, you take care of perhaps some debt that is owed. And that's what we're talking about here, is how Jesus' death atones for us, for our captivity to sin and death, to our limited life without him. That's what we're talking about. But again, that's what the questions are about. But, well, how does this thing work? Now, most Christians, I'm assuming most of us here today, have at least heard some explanations offered. I think, for example, of the one that probably most people have heard of, and that is the idea that Jesus' death on a cross was a sacrifice that somehow cured or covered over our sin. This is mentioned in the New Testament. There have been countless Christians who've written hymns and sung about this. It's the idea that somehow what the Old Testament described about the sacrifice of animals would then also apply to Jesus. And let me make sure that's clear. In the Old Testament, whenever the Hebrew people sinned or fell short and didn't keep God's laws, it was felt that if an animal was sacrificed, that might represent the regret and the request for forgiveness that people had, and that in some way the sacrifice of an animal took the wrath of God away that those people might deserve. And so sometimes people borrow that whole imagery, that whole idea of a sacrifice being made that somehow pays a price, that is what happened when Jesus was on the cross. His death was kind of a sacrifice for all of us. Again, most people have heard that because probably in our world today, that's maybe the one explanation that's offered over and over again, although there are others. I think of example of the idea that Jesus was a captive who was offered as ransom for us. And again, this may be familiar to many of you. The idea was that those of us who fall short, who don't keep what God asks of us, sooner or later we become captive to evil. And we're held almost as prisoners by evil. Again, Christian writers throughout the centuries have borrowed from the idea that sometimes people are held as ransom and a price has to be paid. That's what they suggest was going on the cross. That all of us were being held as captives by evil. A ransom had to be paid. God paid the ransom in the form of sacrificing God's Son. Now, those are just some of the explanations that have been offered over the centuries about how Jesus' faith in being on the cross somehow changes us. Those aren't the only explanations that could be offered. In fact, if you Google it, you might want to do that as your homework. If you Google theories of the atonement, that's your homework, you'll see that some people suggest there are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kinds of ways you could explain the atonement. But then that circles back to the idea of hard questions. Hard question is, do we have to accept one of those? Do we have to believe that if we're going to be Christians? That's the hard statement that might be made. For after all, if you start to push at any of those explanations, they always somehow fall short. Does God really want sacrifices made in order to forgive us? Or if God pays a ransom to evil, is evil somehow equal to God, that they can do contracts between each other? Again, when you start pushing at all these theories, they seem to fall short. So what I'm in a sense asking today is, do we have to accept one of them? Do we have to believe one of them if we're going to be a follower of Christ? Well, the answer I want to offer today is that we do not have to believe any of these explanations. We certainly want to believe that Jesus chose his death. It was not accidental, or it was not a matter of bad politics, but he chose, as the scripture said, to lay down his life for his sheep. And we often want to say it makes a difference. It makes a difference to me, to you, to everybody who's ever lived who's a Christian. We have somehow, after Jesus' death, felt like a door was opened. And there are new possibilities for us that never existed before him. But how we get from one to the other, it's okay to say we can't fully explain that. How we get from the one to the other, it's okay to say, I still haven't ended all of my questions. Most helpful thing to me is a suggestion made by the great Christian writer C.S. Lewis. And if you've never read his little book called Mere Christianity, I highly recommend it. It's a great, simple explanation, very logical, very thought out about the Christian faith. It's somewhat dated. Some of the examples are somewhat dated. Still worth the read. But Lewis, in that book, in talking about this very thing, says very often we do things, and they have power and meaning for us, whether we can fully explain them or not. Take, for example, he said, of what we eat. It's good for us. We should eat, whether we always know how that works. I was thinking about this because just a couple of weeks ago, about 18th century sailing voyages. In the book, I also recommend that. It's called The Wager. It's on the bestseller list. It's about a shipwreck. But in the book, the author was describing the hardships of sailing in those days. And he talks about the disease that's called scurvy. Do you know that in long sailing voyages in the 18th century, roughly it was assumed that half of all sailors would eventually die from scurvy? That being that us use. Let's see why I make it in more. I have a. That's better. All right. I'll stay in one place. As you all know, I like to wander back and forth. I'll just stand right here. Let me go back to scurvy. Anyway, so this was a tremendous disease that took a great toll in sailing history that could have simply been prevented if people had citrus fruits or vegetables. Nobody knew this. They were hard to transport. And so very often sailors would go long pitches without either citrus fruits or vegetables. And because of that, then people suffered and died. But the point is this. You know, there were sea captains who somehow stumbled on the idea that they should be eating vegetables, citrus fruits. But not everybody would do it because not everybody could explain exactly how it worked. But the point was, they didn't have to explain how it worked. All they had to do was to eat those citrus fruits and vegetables, and men would not have died. C.S. Lewis points to that and says, we can't always explain how vitamins work or how our bodies handle nutrition, but we eat nonetheless. And so he says, whether we can fully explain the cross and all that Jesus did there, in the end, is not what matters. What matters in the end is that we open ourselves to its power and to what it can do, and we give thanks to God for that gift. You know, also, there's a book about the Holocaust. It was written a generation or so ago by a woman by the name of Corrie ten Boom. Corrie ten Boom was a woman who grew up in Amsterdam. During the Second World War, her family were very devout Christians, and they felt it was their duty to hide Jewish families, to protect them from imprisonment. The name of her book was called The Hiding Place, but eventually the authorities discovered that their family was indeed hiding Jewish families, and so they were all separated and sent to concentration camps. Corrie ten Boom, as a young teenager, went with her sister, and they were both imprisoned in the camp. Eventually, her sister died. But Corrie ten Boom, in writing about this, tells about the day when, simply as an exercise in power and authority, the guards required all of the female prisoners to completely remove all of their clothing. Very humiliating requirement that was asked of these teenage girls. And as they were lined up, completely naked, Corrie ten Boom said she had a thought. And this is how she writes about it. This is what she says. She says, on that morning, during this supposed inspection, it suddenly came to mind that long ago on the cross, Jesus too had been stripped of his clothes, and that he had hung there naked. She says, I had not known, had not thought. The paintings, the carved crucifixes always show at least a scrap of cloth. But suddenly I knew that was just the respect and the reverence of the artist. But at that time itself, on that Friday morning, there was no reverence. No more than I saw now in the faces around us. She says, I leaned towards my sister, Betsy, ahead of me in line. Her shoulder blades stood out, sharp and thin beneath her blue mottled skin. Betsy, I said, they took Jesus' clothes too. And ahead of me, I heard her words, oh, Corrie, and I never thanked him. The point is not to understand and explain everything, but to know that something powerful for us happened. And our faithful response is to give thanks. Amen.